I have never had a hunter or angler tell me that he or she wants a dirtier environment with less fish and wildlife, but that would be an end result if this bill is written, as written, would become law. Even more troubling, though, is inclusion of 3 new provisions in this year's draft that can only be described as an extremely early Christmas present to the gun lobby. Using this bill to preempt state and local gun safety laws, relax import restrictions on deadly weapons from Russia and elsewhere, and make it easier for criminals to get their hands on silencers and armor-piercing bullets, sells out sportsmen and make a mockery of what should be a thoughtful, bipartisan process. Committee Republicans, the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation, and organizations representing real hunters and anglers have allowed gun and ammo pushers like the NRA and the National Shooting Sports Foundation to hijack this legislation, particularly given that the first scheduled hearing on this bill was canceled just 3 months ago in the wake of a shooting rampage that left one of our fellow members of Congress fighting for his life. I find it incredibly shameful that these provisions that would make Americans less safe are still part of this legislative package.
This is legislation that purports to help sportsmen and gun owners like myself, but instead threatens our public safety and security. It is also worth noting that this legislation was originally scheduled to be heard before the committee on the very morning that a shooter targeted members of Congress at a baseball practice. Lives were spared that day because people recognized the unique sound of gunfire and were able to take cover. This bill would remove gun silencers from regulations under the National Firearms Act. The NFA is one of the most effective pieces of gun legislation ever enacted into law. Should silencers be removed from the NFA, individuals unable to pass a background check would be able to obtain these dangerous weapons through unregulated private sales on the internet and at gun shows. Existing loopholes already threaten the safety of law enforcement in our gun laws. Firearms-related incidents were the #1 cause of death for law enforcement in 2016, and 21 of the 64 cop killings were the result of ambush-style attacks, the highest total in more than 2 decades. As an ATF agent, I often heard calls that I should focus on enforcing the laws on the books. I agree now more than ever. We cannot allow profits to be prioritized over public safety. The proposal overrides state laws regarding how firearms must be stored in vehicles traveling across state lines. This bill would authorize personal litigation against law enforcement officers investigating travelers suspected of firearms trafficking, thereby weakening law enforcement's ability to simply do their jobs and raising the risk of guns stolen from cars.
So it is true, one of the things that we've heard is that if someone used a silencer and was shooting at a crowd, it would make it that much more difficult for law enforcement to actually triangulate or find that person who is shooting the weapon. Is that a correct statement?
That's correct. And in Dallas, the recent ambush shooting of police officers there that killed 5, if that person had used a silencer, it would have been very difficult for the people on the ground to immediately understand that they were being shot at. And then at night, it would have been allowed the shooter to move and conceal themselves and possibly even get away.
So for somebody who is hunting using a silencer, just so that we can put these 2 testimonies together, they would still require to use some kind of hearing device anyway, protection device.
If they cared about their ears, they would.
Thank you. Is it my understanding that you've brought some props to demonstrate to us so that it always makes your testimony more real? So if you can show that to us, please.
Sure. Just an example of what would be common. Everyone has seen this if they have a spouse that snores, but they're the same things that we use in law enforcement, earplugs. What's nice about this, I bought this at the drugstore, it gives you a certification on the side that rates how much the sound is diminished. We also have passive earmuffs. What this does is it also deadens the sound. These are rated at 35. Again, it's certified and regulated by the government, so you know what you're buying. And then for hunters who have the concern that you don't want to not be able to hear anything, you just don't want to hear that gunshot that can damage your ear, they have new technologies. This costs about $60. You can spend more than that. This actually allows you to listen to your MP3 player. You can hear deer in the background, but what it'll do is cut out that explosive sound of a gun so you don't damage your ear. years. And so my friends who are hunters at ATF, they use any combination of this each and every time they fire a gun, and I don't know any that have chosen to buy silencers as the primary reason to protect their hearing.
Thank you very much. I'm running out of time, so with that, Mr. Chair, you back.
Mr. Chipman, on your comment that the shooting at the ball field, that the sound saved lives, have you talked to any of the people who were out there that morning?
I haven't. I've just seen their testimony on TV like the rest of us. And one yesterday was the lobbyist who was shot in the chest. And he said from the first sound he immediately recognized it as a gunshot and dove into into one of the dugouts there. So, not allowing someone to shoot at you again is really important in a critical incident like that.
Yeah, I would draw some difference with your testimony there that the first shot actually didn't sound like a gunshot at all. It sounded as if somebody had pushed a filing cabinet out the back of a truck and it hit. It was a very metallic sound. Didn't sound like gunfire.
Angelinos are painfully aware of the dangers of silencers-equipped firearms because of the disgraced ex-LAPD officer who used silencers on his weapons to go on a killing spree back in 2013. Christopher Dornan was a former LAPD officer who used silencers to go on a 10-day shooting spree throughout the Los Angeles area from February 3rd to the 12th of 2013. During his spree, Dornan used silencers to evade police while killing 4 people, including 2 police officers. His use of silencers made it difficult for witnesses and police to discern where the shots were coming from. This gave Dornan a distinct tactical advantage against the police as they chased them through the LA area, and it wasn't until police could track down Dornan to a remote mountain cabin that they put an end to his murdering spree.
In 2007, my constituents lost friends and loved ones because of the mass shootings at Virginia Tech. Students and teachers heard the sound of gunfire long before they saw the shooter. Some were able to use that time to hide or escape. If the sound of those shots had been muted or distorted, many more people might have died. Across the country, dozens of cities, including Washington, D.C., have deployed technologies that are able to identify based on sound exactly when and where shots are being fired. This information enables law enforcement to more quickly respond to dangerous situations. We can measure the results in lives saved.
This bill in particular would make silencers more readily available to criminals because for the first time in 80 years, private parties could sell these guns without background checks on the internet and in gun shows. And this has never been the case before. And one of the reasons that we have not seen silencers out there in tons of crimes is the fact that we have a regulatory structure that makes it very difficult to get these. It is true that if you use a silencer in a crime, you can get a very serious sentence. But as an ATF agent, my job was to prevent the bad thing from happening in the first place. And so what you want to do is keep silencers out of the hands of people before they use them in a criminal way. And our structure today is doing that, not all of the time, but better than other dangerous weapons that aren't regulated in this way.
It reduces sound. It can still be heard. Some people recommend that you use hearing protection even though you have a suppressed firearm because it's still going to be loud. But
Mr. Chairman, I've spent 30 years on both active and reserve military duty and had the opportunity to handle and fire a variety of guns, pistols, and rifles. And for over 80 years, silencers have been effectively regulated under the National Firearms Act. To obtain a suppressor, an individual must follow common sense safety requirements which are designed to keep silencers out of the wrong hands. The current law works. Crimes involving silencers are rare, so rare that the data is almost negligible. In fact, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms reports that the agency has only recommended prosecutions for 44 silencer-related crimes per year over the past decade. The current law works. The entire purpose of a silencer is to suppress the sound of the gunfire, which, however, and dangerously reduces the ability of law enforcement to effectively hear the shots and respond accordingly.
The questions, though, that I'm concerned about are Title 16, which is known as the Lawful Purpose and Self-Defense Act. To me, that's equally troubling. It It amends existing federal gun laws by replacing references to sporting purposes to references to lawful purposes, therefore dramatically increasing the kinds of firearms that may be brought into the United States.
This opens up a category of weapons that would be designed as weapons of war or could be categorized as weapons that would be used in self-defense rather than sporting. This could open floodgates of Chinese-made AK-47 variants, these types of things that I think where we would see in the market a change is that these firearms are often produced at a price point that is less than high-quality American-made rifles of this sort. And in my experience, gun traffickers, when they like to collect firearms for resale, they like to keep the price of those guns that they're purchasing low. And so any kind of foreign-made weapons that fit into the mind of a criminal as potentially an assault rifle, they would like those to then resell on the internet and at gun shows so that they can make a profit. Clearly, if you're buying a well-made American version of this, the ability to profit from that is less because the guns are high quality and cost more. So I think that that would probably be what we would see as consumers here in America or what we see available on the internet for sale.
Have law enforcement groups weighed in on this provision? How do they feel about the fact that this bill would make it easier for everyday people to obtain armor-producing or armor-piercing ammunition? How does law enforcement feel about that aspect?
Well, currently I'm a member of the Firearms Committee of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, so I do dialogue with my peers in law enforcement. And I think law enforcement understands that certain rounds used in hunting applications are reasonable, but as cops, we're very concerned when these rifle rounds end up in newly manufactured handguns, and that can penetrate the vests that agents and officers typically wear. And so our concern is just one of there's a threat here, and we'd like Congress to balance this threat to keep officers and members of the public safe from these types of rounds of ammunition being used in a criminal and inappropriate way.
But this bill does not deal with that balance.
It doesn't. It creates a problem and does not offer the counterbalance, which is, yes, I can imagine hunting applications where these rounds would make sense, but what as a government are we going to do to protect the cop in the street from ensuring that these rounds don't end up in criminal hands? And it's that lack of balance that I find concerning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Gahalva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chipman, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service protecting public safety as an AFT agent and as in your career. You know, I find it curious that we all love cops, Mr. Chipman, and then the minute a career law enforcement officer comes to this committee and tells us what we are doing in this legislation is dangerous for public safety, suddenly that credibility is lost. I guess the only experts we listen to when it comes to issues of gun safety are gun manufacturers that stand to profit from this legislation considerably. Why do you think the committee is choosing to pursue a policy that major law enforcement groups staunchly oppose or do not support? Mr. Chipman.
So I can't get into the head of every member, but you know, to be clear, the Police Foundation, the Police Executive Research Forum, the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, Major City Chiefs, the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, the Commission on the Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. These are all large, respected law enforcement leadership organizations. My peers in law enforcement see that we have a proper balance today. Silencers are legal. You can buy them. In fact, we're seeing sales of silencers more this year than ever in the history of this country. What we're concerned about is why undercut a system that has worked. As everyone has said, silencers are rarely used in crime because they're very difficult to get. And that's good for America. It's that proper balance. Law-abiding people can exercise their rights, and law enforcement can be given the support they need to prevent crimes from ever happening in the first place. So
Credo will be delivering about 90,000 signatures, petitions in opposition and asking Congress to reject the deregulation of gun silencers. We should probably listen to them. As far as I know, hunters don't use silencers or armor-piercing bullets. That's so we're not talking about helping them in this legislation. And the NRA knows this, and other efforts like it are politically divisive. They don't care. This is about red meat, not getting anything done. We should be improving conservation policy, helping sportsmen enjoy our public lands. That's important goals. Pushing these extreme ideas makes it harder to accomplish those goals for sportsmen and for the people that and for the veterans being served.
To summarize, it seems like this, this idea that suppressors for hunting is more cover than anything else, because it's more politically sellable to say that we're trying to protect hunters' hearing than to say we just want to boost the profits of gun manufacturers and or suppressor manufacturers. So I think that's the point that I've learned from this. So thank you, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Hallbrook pointed out that the number of crimes involving silencers is very, very low, the implication being there's just no connection at all. But it's possible that the lack of crimes involving silencers has something to do with the fact that we've been regulating silencers pretty heavily for over 80 years. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
yes, and the same stats apply to machine guns and pipe bombs, which are already regulated under the same act. So it's legislation, as I said in my opening, that really works.
I just want to say that the minority party only gets one witness at this hearing. We're grossly outnumbered in this particular forum. Mr. Chipman's done a great job. We appreciate his perspective. But the other perspective that should always be part of this conversation, because this bill will make gun violence worse, are the victims of gun violence who are here. So I want to thank them, and I want to encourage them to continue to be part of the conversation.
The fact that this bill doesn't have the approval of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus shows that the gun lobby has hijacked what is traditionally bipartisan legislation. It's worth noting that this hearing was initially supposed to take place in June, but was postponed due to a shooting at a congressional baseball practice in my district. And after rescheduling the hearing, the NRA representative was removed from the witness list, which is unfortunate because I would have really appreciated the opportunity to ask him questions about the NRA's ads against candidate Hillary Clinton, claiming that she was a threat to the Second Amendment because she supported background checks for gun purchases. For 8 years before the NRA peddled those same lies against President Obama. Gun dealers held Obama sales, and signs at gun shows warned, "Get your guns while you still can." 8 years of these lies and fear-mongering have contributed significantly to the polarization in America, but it also led to the doubling of gun production and record-high profits for the gun industry. Though, of course, none of those things that the NRA predicted ever came to pass. So with President Obama out and a pro-NRA president in, sales and stock values are down. The gun industry is desperate to keep the profits flowing, hence this bill. Mr. Chipman, what effect would this have on gun running, on being able to go back and forth from Virginia to New York with tons of guns in your trunk?
The immediate impact would be the 1.3 million silencers currently registered could be put up on the internet for sale, which is forbidden today. And what you would find is immediately trafficking channels going to those states that choose today to actually ban silencers. There are only 8 of them. And so you would now have trafficking in silencers, which we don't have today. It'd be a new problem that would happen immediately, driven just by the economies of they would be of value and they would be easily able to be resold for profit.
And Mr. Chipman, I know you probably weren't an English major, but the House Committee on Natural Resources defines its jurisdiction, quote, as legislation about American energy production, mineral lands and mining, fisheries and wildlife, public lands, oceans, Native Americans, irrigation, and reclamation. So I don't know if firearm silencers are energy, mineral resources, fisheries, wildlife, public lands, oceans, Native Americans, irrigation, and reclamation.
This would seem to be an issue that should be in a criminal justice-based forum because of the threats to public safety.